YouTube page to see if it appears. Let's have a look. I think it's about to, something is about to happen. There we go. Please stand by still. No, still says please stand by. Come on, bastard. Links, make sure we've got the right link. There we go. Okay, aha, this is it now. It's about to happen. Let me mute that.
Are we live? Is the revolution upon us?
I think the revolution is upon us. I think we're up and running. I need to make sure that I tweeted the right link. Here is. There we go. Please stand by still. And still says please stand by. Come on, bastards. Okay, fine. Links. Make sure you've got the right link. There we go. Oh God, I think I can hear myself in some window I can't identify.
Right, hold on.
I think it's you, isn't it?
Yeah, got it.
That was you.
Yeah,
okay. Well, I think we're there. I think this is us. I think the revolution is upon us. I think. Oh, that's you. That's you.
I close it. We're good. We're good. It's all good.
Okay.
We're not putting people on the Mars, so we're good.
No, I know, but it's very complicated. I've never hosted one of these things before. I've never done it myself. Okay, people can see my tweed jacket, which means that we're up and running. That's fine. Okay, good, great. Sorry, he's such a useless wreck of a British human being. Okay, fine. Well, hello. How are you? You're newly silenced, which is probably a new feeling for you.
Yeah, it's quite actually. It's like a cleanse, though. It really is. It's quite
like a juice cleanse. I've done
this time now on my hands. I don't know what to do with myself. I think things and then I don't immediately tweet them. And I imagine this is what it was like for mortals a long time ago.
It's going to introduce a whole new moment of Zen into your life. So tell me, for those who don't know about you and don't know what happened, I'm going to give the opportunity to just explain briefly what went on, and then we can get into stuff. Hi, if you're watching, we have progressed past our initial moment of total technical incompetence, which is all my fault. I'm Milo Yiannopoulos. I'm a writer for Breitbart and a bunch of other places, and I'm here with Chuck or Charles C. Johnson, who is the editor and founder of GotNews.com, is a controversial right-wing newsman who gets himself into all sorts of trouble on a near weekly basis, very often becoming unpopular with all the right people in the process. But Charles, you went a bit far this week. Say some. Tell us what happened.
So I would just kind of push back a little bit against the right-wing caricature, just real quick.
Sure. I'm teeing these up for you, so you can.
Yeah. Well, thank you. No, I like, by the way, this is very much the spirit of Andrew Breitbart. I mean, I worked for him. I was one of the last employees to talk to him before he died, and so this is kind of fun. And I'm excited to be here. So very, very kind of briefly, I run this website, GotNews.com. We've broken a number of stories that have been controversial. It's a crowd-funded, crowd-sourced news company. It may appear that all posts are written by yours truly, but I assure you this was by design because there are certain people who want to get information out, and they don't necessarily want their names associated with it. Now, I do write the majority of the content, but I got in trouble because I tweeted out, actually, let me kind of set the stage, actually. So my wife and I had a lovely dinner of tacos. We were watching Anthony Bourdain and folding the laundry, and somebody reached out to me on Twitter and said, how much would it cost you to do a research project on Jure McKesson, who, for those of you who don't know, it's at Jure, and he is a sort of radical activist associated with the Black Lives Matters group. And I said, oh, it'd probably take $500 to take him out. And that's when my troubles began.
Yeah.
That a number of people said I was soliciting his murder, I was trying to kill him or what have you, and I didn't even see any of this stuff. I just went to bed. I think my last ever tweet was, I'm controversial because I see the world differently. Just kind of an ironic one to go out on.
Talk us through, just to start off with, talk us through what you meant by it'll take $500.
Oh, yeah. So to give you a sense, I run a network.
I know what I would understand that phrase to mean, which would be you want to do a journalistic hit job on him, right? When I saw it, that's
not really a hit job. But I like using the vernacular of kind of fun, edgy kind of approach. So like both the British parties, the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, have both referred to it as, as taking somebody out. Slate wrote a thing on taking out court judges, or Supreme Court judge. It's a common part of the vernacular. I admit it's a bit kind of odd. It's an odd formulation, but I speak oddly. I mean, I use a variant of the spelling of octoroon.
I'm not sure I find it odd in the least bit. Sorry to interrupt you. So to make your point for you, but I'm not sure that I find it odd in the least bit. I think it's very common.
Well, it's a common phrase, but usually people say take down, but I often say take out. I mean, I prefer take out because it's fewer characters on Twitter. In fact, most of the stuff that I get in trouble for is when I'm concatenating words.
So brevity is the source of all of your trouble, huh?
Yeah, brevity is the source of all wit and the source of all. It's the key to the Twitter gulag.
All right. So you said
anyway, so
$500 to take this guy out.
Yeah. So basically, what I do is I'm constantly getting research projects all the time, and in fact, I hire people that I meet. Some of them are actually Gamergate, enthusiasts. And my email address is editor@gotnews.com, and I'm constantly soliciting tips and information from people. And sometimes I'll pay them, sometimes not. Sometimes they want to be volunteers. And I have this database of like nerd researchers. And what we do is we are sort of guardians of the internet, if you will, or we're guardians of things associated with bad people on the internet. And we've been involved in things like exposing the name of Jackie Coakley, the girl who lied about the UVA rape case. We've been involved with proving that Sony wasn't hacked by North Korea, but by an insider who released the information. We've been involved in some other stories as well. And what happens, we did the Adult Friend Finder leak. We did a lot of stories out of that, and there are a lot more to come of politicians and others who are doing that kind of thing. So this is kind of par for the course. I put out bounties for information to get people interested and to basically, and then I hit people on their PayPal links or Bitcoin or what have you. And what happened was D-Ray and a number of others used this as a vehicle for promoting this idea that there's this white supremacist narrative in American culture. There are a number of kind of activists in the Ferguson crowd who are upset with me because I've exposed a number of their members to be frauds. So I exposed a child molester a while back who was in their organization. I exposed Basim Masri. I actually worked with some other people on this too. Basim Masri, who was a guy who was threatening police officers and who was arrested for spitting on them and for essentially being violent. I've exposed Sean King, who is a serial fraudster, at Sean King on Twitter, who's stolen money from Haiti orphans. And I've also exposed Wesley Lowery, who is sort of the go-to kind of black correspondent, if you will, of the Washington Post. So these guys don't like me, and so they saw this as an opportunity. And I woke up, and a friend of my grandma's initially reached out to me on the internet. I think either reached out to me or called me. I kind of always forget because we're now in this kind of weird age where people reaching out or everything. But anyways, they contacted me and said, "Oh, you're on CNN." And I'm like, "No, I'm like in my living room, like I'm having a green tea, like I'm having a good day." And they're like, "No, they're saying you're trying to assassinate somebody. What's this about?" And then my phone explodes, and I get all these messages saying that I'm banned from blocked from Twitter. And by the way, this is my 4th time that I've been banned from Twitter. The first 3 times, and cut in any time because I tend to be loquacious.
No.
But the first time I was banned for naming Nina Pham, who was the nurse who had Ebola, which I named her 12 hours before everybody else in America. The second time I was banned for publishing the address of a quarantine site that wasn't being quarantined at the Ebola situation. And the third time I was banned for naming Jackie Coakley, the girl who lied in the UVA rape scandal. And so all those are journalistic enterprises. If I were Gawker, for instance, they would give me, plaudits or whatever. But because I'm not, and because I'm a brand challenger, and because I'm kind of a rebel, people like to punish me, and they like to abuse Twitter's policies. Now, I think this is going to be a really interesting.
Say this though, it's not solely that you're a rebel. It's also, I think, that you do things that some people would consider outside the bounds of journalistic enterprise. Now, I'm not. I may express a view on that later, but what I'm trying to get at is, there's a view there's certainly an argument posited that you do stuff that journalists shouldn't do. You go further than journalists ought to go, and you can probably think yourself of a few examples of that. You take iterative or process journalism to a sort of stream of consciousness level where inevitably there are going to be mistakes about certain stories.
Indeed.
By and large, you probably get things right, and by and large, you publish before everybody else, which is why you seem to have this extraordinary influence and effect on the rest of the news media. But do you understand people who, and we're going to get into the ethics of the ban in a minute, but just essentially talking about you, do you understand what some of the criticisms are of the way you do business and of the way
Sure. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. So I'm interested in taboos and how taboos are used to essentially enforce social norms. And what I mean by this is that in the United States, we have the Bill of Rights, right? Your First Amendment, your Second Amendment, so on and so forth. And I'm interested in kind of fostering a culture of expanded civil liberties and expanded rights. I don't believe in kind of legalistically approaching it. So I'm a First Amendment absolutist. I believe kind of our duty as journalists or as purveyors of information is to actually expand these liberties that have existed, in America, and obviously going way back to the Magna Carta back in Britain. And the reason I do these things, the reason I'm deliberately provocative, is in part because I read this book by Ryan Holiday called Trust Me, I'm Lying, which I highly recommend.
I read your interview with him, actually. And
yeah, so
he sort of reluctantly takes some of the responsibility for you, I think, in that interview, and says, this guy has read my book, done all of the stuff that I was pointing out you shouldn't do, and he's just sort of run with it and almost used the warning chapters almost as a how-to guide.
Yes. No. In fact, I not quite, but I had sort of journalistic establishment bona fides. I worked at the Wall Street Journal editorial page. I won 2 journalistic awards. I had all these kind of offers. I worked at different publications. There's a scurrilous thing out there on Gawker about how I'd been fired from from various things. I've never been fired from any job in my life, except when I worked for my parents, and then I was rehired the next day. And I did quit a job where I was digging a trench halfway through, so I feel kind of guilty about it. But she was attractive.
Well, since it wasn't during a war, you're probably okay with that.
No, it wasn't. No. So that's kind of the extent of kind of my situation. And now I'm accused of being a white supremacist because I treat people who have white supremacist views as if they're human beings.
Well, let's get back to that in a second.
Yeah, we can get back to that in a second. I like to use the language, and I like to use inflammatory language to draw attention to issues. And I realized when I worked for Andrew Breitbart and for others that the kind of nerd researcher advantage that I had of finding information before everyone else, that in the internet age I was constantly getting plagiarized and people were stealing my material, and that I wasn't getting the influence I needed. So I decided to become essentially a celebrity, and I used Twitter because that's where all the celebrities and beautiful people are. I used that as the vehicle to do that. Previously, I had basically been a nerd researcher who made money doing research gigs for various people, for working with law enforcement on some projects, and that was kind of my day-to-day life. And I was very unhappy when Andrew Breitbart died, and I was very unhappy with kind of the nature of the way the news business was going. Of sort of facts were kind of loosey-goosey. I was upset at kind of the way the social justice warriors were policing the discourse. And kind of eroding people's civil liberties, like their right to speech, like their right to due process, like in the rape cases. And I enjoy being deliberately inflammatory so that these other journalists who don't like me, who aren't as good researchers, actually advertise my work by status signaling that I'm a terrible person. That makes sense.
And we've certainly seen a lot of that happening with Gawker. I mean, I sort of knew who you were, but you first really came to my interest and attention because I saw a bunch of Gawker hit pieces on you, and I thought this guy must be okay. In
fact, the Gawker stuff, just to kind of, there are 3 things that they accuse me of. One is shitting on the floor in college. I actually
let's put this to rest.
All right, fair enough.
Once and for all, on this stream, did you shit on the floor at college?
No, I wish I had, though, because if I'm going to do the crime, I might as well do the time. Yeah, if I'm going to do the time, I might as well do the crime.
Right. Okay.
But no, I was remarkably chaste and boring in college. I was such a nerd that I couldn't get a date, and I ran a website that caused all this controversy called the Claremont Conservative that ultimately won with me winning several journalistic awards and stopping an Arabic program for a Jew-hating professor, essentially reducing this program. And I never, I also exposed this Jerusalem Post editor, Michael Wilner, who was who savagely beat up a girl on the bathroom, on the dance floor, and he now works for the Jerusalem Post, the Washington bureau chief, and I exposed him doing this, and I had free speech in my comment section, so somebody accused me of shitting on the floor in college, when in fact my next door neighbor who had norovirus or something. Anyways, long story short, I didn't do it.
I think we get the idea. I'm happy to do that before we get into any grisly details. Let me ask you a more general question. Why do people lie about you so much?
Because they're threatened by me. I'm doing their jobs better than they are on a shoestring budget, and I'm affecting the discourse in this country, and in fact around the world. I've broken stories in Australia, that have been covered, like in the Sydney siege and other things. And I'm kind of a jerk, partly because I'm autistic, or like on the autism scale or whatever, partly because I'm a ginger. And by the way, we're not all terrorists, although I was a Twitter terrorist until they took away my power.
You were a Twitter terrorist. No, I mean, as you know, I'm a connoisseur of the science and of behind attraction and non-attraction to ginger people. So we can maybe come on to that later.
Yeah, but, gingerism is a problem, gingivitis.
Well,
you see no freckles on me, which kind of pisses me off.
Yeah, you missed out on that particular gene cluster, but for viewers who don't know, I wrote a piece about the extraordinarily high incidence of white British converts to radical Islam with ginger hair, and something like 76% of all white British converts to Islam have ginger hair. They're dramatically more likely to have ginger hair if you're a white British convert to radical Islam than the rest of the population. And the ginger jihadis.
I blame the bullying. They're just looking for an outlet.
Well, it's a combination of things, actually. Partly there's the evolutionary reason why people aren't attracted to people with ginger hair and freckles.
Yep. They're banned from gene pools, even if they have high IQs.
Right, and partly it's cultural, because at least in Britain, that country in particular has the most virulent ginger prejudice of anywhere in the world. Because we've had a long-standing antagonism with our Scottish neighbours to the north, and then the Irish potato famine, of course, when everyone came over hungry, looking for food and stealing from the English in the 1800s. So there's a lot of sort of complex genetic, evolutionary, and cultural reasons why gingers are particularly.
I love the piece. I give it to everyone. I send it out.
I find the subject fascinating. Anyway. Before we get onto the sort of specifics,
why do journalists hate me? Why do they lie about me?
Okay, no, I mean, I understand the thing about sort of the nerd journalism, getting the stories first, having this sort of army. I recognize some of that stuff too. What I'm I suppose what I'm seeking to understand before we get into the sort of nitty gritty of the Twitter issue and what the consequences of this are, and whether you think it's a free speech issue, whether you think it's a censorship issue. Just one more perhaps question about you, which is, people see, and many people on the internet seem to really admire your sort of bloodhound instinct. You have this this desire to root out stories and sort of insatiable drive. And I sort of wanted to ask where it comes from. You obviously have had a career previously in establishment media, if you like, but where does this sort of obsessive news instinct comes from? Because you seem to have a sort of insatiable lust for breaking stories and having that sort of influence and having people know that you are the one that broke the story. A lot of journalists are egotists, and a lot of journalists have that sort of slightly fanatical streak to them. But where does it come from in you particularly? Because you seem to have it to a higher degree than most people in the industry.
Sure. Well, again, you're evaluating me based upon Twitter, which I understand kind of the math and algorithm of Twitter very, very well. So I deliberately manipulate some of it, which is not necessarily how I am in kind of the real world. But let's assume for the sake of the argument that I kind of agree with you and that the Twitter of me is the same me, right? I have always been very, very good at noticing patterns in things. I've always had kind of a freakish ability to do it. I don't know where it comes from. I think it's genetic. I mean, my uncle was a
high-functioning autistic sort of side of your brain or something.
Maybe. I mean, I've always noticed things like people who couldn't tell various. In the Temple Grandin movie, there's a thing where she can tell all the different spoons, apart. I can always do those types of things, and I was always very, very good at it. And I was always very good in school, and I was always very good at basically noticing things and being kind of original and out of the box in my thinking. And partly it's because when I grew up, my mother had cancer when I was 8, which we thought was going to be fatal, or at least I thought it was going to be fatal. And so I kind of had to develop mannerisms and ways of thinking about the world that were different from other children. And then I was in public school, and I was one of the top students in public school, won a number of contests and things, got on the radar of this prep school in my area, which invited me to apply, went to the prep school, created a website where it was free speech, caused all this controversy around race matters, which I actually didn't participate in because my mother again had cancer. And she's still alive, by the way, fortunately. And so I've always been kind of an outsider, even though I was always kind of an insider. And I had the right pedigree, I had the right grades and everything. And I've always been fascinated at how institutions and individuals work. And I think on the right generally, and I eschew the kind of label of right-wing because I have all sorts of views on all kinds of topics. I like the phrase rebel alliance. I like the phrase radical. I like the phrase revolutionary. I don't find myself agreeing. I kind of see, like, I actually see you as a kind of phenomenon of this too. Of like, I don't see the conventional labels being all that useful in an age where we can define ourselves any way we see fit on the internet. I think it makes sense.
It's a more complex way in which we identify ourselves and we relate to the rest of the world. I mean, for example, in this sort of weird box where I have, largely speaking, economically right-wing views and broadly speaking socially right-wing views. I sort of say the things that a conservative would say, yet I'm obsessed with RuPaul's Drag Race and Mariah Carey, and it's very difficult to sort of
I met RuPaul, by the way. I'm a big fan.
Very jealous of him.
I actually wrote about him in the school newspaper, and I was going to write something critical of him, but I found out I actually liked him and enjoyed him.
Well, you see, he's on the right side of the tranny v drag queens debate, you see, which we may get into later. It's the two different possible responses to trauma and to sort of difficult life experiences. The one is the sort of self-pitying, whinging, controlling, authoritarian pronoun route that so many transgender campaigners seem to go down. And the other is the comedic, clownish, fuck you lifestyle of the drag queens. So I wrote a piece a long time ago, before these people started warring, saying there's a trannies v drag queens war coming, and indeed it did.
What I found infectious about him, though, when I met him, just not to name drop or whatever, but he was a lot of fun. He enjoyed himself. And I think
this is what you don't see on the other side of that.
Right, and I think you and I have that in common. I, for many years, basically toiled in relative obscurity, having other people claim credit for my work. Like when I outed the Syria analyst who lied about the Syria war and exposed her and ended her career. And I cut off all of my ties with the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which printed her story and ultimately printed a retraction of it, where she faked her PhD. Elizabeth O'Baggy is her name. She now works for John McCain, by the way, just to show you how mixed up these political things are. And when I kind of did that, I kind of separated myself from a lot of people. And I decided I was going to say what I wanted to say, do what I wanted to do, live the life I wanted to, and fuck it. Like, we'll see what happens.
But you seem to go out of your way to upset people sometimes. I mean, you know, you seem to go out of your way in ways that perhaps are not. I'm just, you know, sort of playing devil's advocate for a bit.
Sure.
You seem to go out of your way to upset people sometimes with stories that are funny, but don't necessarily have much of a factual basis. Now, for example, we all loved and laughed at Joan Rivers when just before she died, you know, a joke about Obama and all the rest of it. But you've claimed a couple of times that Obama is gay.
Yes. You want me to elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, why do you think? Why would you say Obama is gay?
All right, so when Andrew Breitbart was alive, he and I did a lot of research on Obama. Do you remember the Derek Bell videos or Big Nothing? I helped find those videos. I helped find a number of things about Obama that went into the public discourse. And when Breitbart was alive, I went to Indonesia. My wife is, you know, Chinese Indonesian, and went to, you know, meet all these things to research Obama, right? And what I found was there were all these black radicals in Chicago who didn't like him, thought he took credit for their work. I discovered this gay gentleman, Larry Golden, who's currently a doctor in Fort Northern California. And he worked at Occidental, and I thought it was very interesting. Like, I like, when I focus on somebody to research them, I focus on the who. I like to find what makes a person tick. I'm much more interested in individuals than I am in institutions. And so what I do is I look at things like, what are the decisions they make to marry? What kind of clothes do they wear? What kind of food do they eat? Who are they? It's kind of like a method actor approach. Yeah. And with Obama, I was researching his book, and there were a lot of things in it that were just factually wrong, just didn't happen, bullshit. Like things like, you know, his step-grandfather died fighting the Dutch, right, or the home burned down. He actually died, the drapes, the home is still up. There's all this stuff that I was discovering about Obama through the process of spending about $100,000 of my own money, like running around, going around the whole country. And the right was interested in talking about, you know, Obama and the economy. And President non-elect Mitt Romney made this whole argument. I was interested in who is Obama. Obama is like one of the most fascinating figures I think, of my lifetime. And I wrote a first book, kind of a critically acclaimed book on Calvin Coolidge. And I was interested, the last redheaded president, by the way. And I was interested in this kind of question.
I'm
like,
a Coolidge fan too, so.
Yeah, how do we get from Coolidge to Obama in my grandparents' lifetime? And so what I discovered on the gay question was I interviewed all these people in Chicago who knew him. There were only 2 women who identified as his girlfriends. He lived with gay men. He, in 1979, joined the gay club at Occidental. I mean, there's all this stuff that starts to pop out at you. And you start to really ask yourself, like, once you start to see it, it starts to become more. Now, I think there have been previous gay presidents, like, as you've, you know, things. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to be a homosexual. Like, it's part of, you know, it's a natural biological process that exists. I do think it's interesting the way in which it's hidden. And I do find that in the opposition research world, a lot of opposition researchers tend to be gay because they understand what it means to be closeted, what it means to hide things, what it means to present dual identity.
Yeah, so there was a great article in Slate a while back which was about homosexuality versus gayness, and gayness being that understanding that you're not quite like the rest of the world, so you have to interact with the rest of the world using a series of masks, and you present yourself in various different ways. And once you realize that the rest of the world is doing that too, it becomes very difficult to take any of it seriously. And that understanding, that once that penny drops, that's the root of camp. That's where the comedy of camp comes from. When you know
I think it's also
any of the rest of the world seriously.
I think it's also where Gawker comes from in the personage of Nixon.
Yes, I think it is. Yeah, yeah. Because he has to a T actually that camp gay sensibility. Although you might not call him he's not the most effeminate man in the world, but he has that camp ironic detachment about the rest of the world, where he knows everybody is playing just as much as he is, or at least
right. It's a sort of a nihilistic thing, but there's sort of a game mechanism to it.
Right, and that's where the comedy comes from, because the moment that you realize the rest of the world is playing a game, you can no longer treat it as anything but an entertainment spectacle.
Indeed, yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, so you take that view, I suppose, in your research. You have a gay man.
Not necessarily. I actually have a very robust code. Like you, I'm a Catholic. I'm a Catholic convert, and I have a very kind of just war theory analysis. I read Balthazar Gracian, you know, Sun Tzu, Machiavelli, all this stuff. I'm fascinated by strategy games. I was a competitive chess player in high school. I played poker, helped pay my way through college that way. So I'm always interested in kind of the strategy of the universe. And my kind of criticism of the right generally, part of the reasons I was actually drawn to Gamergate, but not to kind of flatter them, but there was a sort of strategy and element to them. And oftentimes I look like I'm making a mistake. So for instance, I've threatened to sue all these people, right? And everyone says, oh, he's a paper tiger.
I asked you about that. It seems like, you sort of throw around these lawsuit threats a lot.
Why am I doing that?
What is it about?
What's it about, right? So the simple answer is I have a year from the point that the defamation is made to actually file the suit. If more and more people are defaming me, I have more and more potential damages. They're all my competitors. They all steal my content. And so I all have an opportunity to actually inflict massive damages on them in the court of public opinion, as well as in the actual courts. So it's kind of a strategy that I've employed and thought about based upon the trading up the system idea of the Ryan Holiday stuff. Basically, I mean, Gawker has made things up about me. They've relied on people who tangentially knew me. And I've always been bullied like my whole life, like actually like real deal bullied, like actually beaten up kind of things. Which is kind of the reason I don't really have any respect for people who say that words hurt them. Because like when I was a kid, I was made fun of for having the mother who had cancer. Like life was difficult. And so I don't have any respect for these, for that kind of way of looking at the world. So the long and short of it is the media are my competitors. And Andrew Breitbart wanted to basically take over to basically war with them and fight with them and argue with them. I want to replace them. And I want to systematically do it with an army of citizen journalists like at Got News, like at my email at editor@gotnews.com, like on Twitter. And as time goes on, I'm going to be building technology companies that reflect kind of the more liberal, in the proper sense, liberties-based approaches to the universe. And to a certain extent, I am bullying. To a certain extent, I am aggressive towards them. I do have a bloodhound instinct. I make no apologies for it. I think the purpose of journalism is to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. And I just think that the kind of social justice warrior kind of thuggery. And by the way, you know, my parents are left-wingers. Like, I work with lots of people. I don't see this as a left-wing, right-wing thing. I see it as an exercise of power and privilege against people for the purposes of power and of image and branding. And so I'm less, you know, some of my best friends and who work with me are actual, like, real deal communists and socialists. I respect them and like them. I'm not a socialist or a communist, but, you know, they see the world in an interesting way. And I want to have more space for people to fly their freak flags in a more serious kind of way. That includes, you know, gay right-wingers or what have you. That includes, you know, the Not Your Shield movement, for instance. It includes white supremacists who also like Beethoven and talking about Bach with me on Twitter direct messages, right?
Since you brought that up again, let's get into that a little bit. I'm keen to. What is that? Okay. Since you brought it up, I'm keen to get into that a little bit. You brought it up twice now, and if one of the charges that's laid against you regularly is that you're a racist, among other things.
Yes.
Why do you think people keep saying that? Is it because of your choice of targets? Is it that do you just happen to find more to object to in certain ethnic groups? Or
No.
Is the charge just entirely baseless?
It's complicated. So let me kind of tease it out. So I believe, you know, I'm a natural rights kind of view of the universe. I think we basically have rights. We are individuals. The government should treat us all as if we have natural rights. And yet we observe that we're genetically very different from one another, even though we're quite, you know, the variation is quite small. So I'm different than my Asian wife, who is in turn different than, you know, so on and so forth. I find this wonderful, this kind of differences that exist in the world. I don't see it as something to be deplored, but I do think it does raise interesting political questions. If there is an IQ bell curve, which I do believe exists, right, with Jews, Asians, and Northern European whites essentially being on the utmost rightward bound of it, and there are kind of leftward, you know, basically with blacks, Aborigines, American Indians being on the kind of leftward side of it, it does raise interesting questions for a regime in which all are grounded on natural equality. So I'm interested in kind of teasing these ideas out. Now, what happens a lot of the time with the journalists is they decide that black person equal victim, or gay equal victim, or basically pick your social justice, you know, three-card Monte game, right? We're going to use this black person to get this power, right? You see this with, say, people like Sean King, for instance, that use Tamir Rice to raise money for themselves. And what they end up doing is they end up basically taking the money for themselves in one form or another. In attention, they basically hijack the media. And I think everyone is fair game. I'm fair game. Everyone who pretends to be a part of the public discourse is fair game. And so I think it's actually more radically egalitarian. Now, do I think there are genetic differences that make blacks more likely to commit violence? I'm kind of of mixed minds about it. I have written about it. I've thought about it. I've talked to geneticists about it. Some who will talk sotto voce with me, and some who will speak more kind of openly. And it's complicated. But I want to live in a world in which the Galileos or the Semmelweises or the Alexander Solzhenitsyns of the world can actually come forward and say, what is the reality of the thing? And I want to basically push the boundaries of acceptable conversation. So, for instance...
And that's why perhaps one person who got in touch with me before this interview said, well, why don't you ask him why he's so preoccupied with black crime? If he's not a racist, why is he always reporting on black crime? What does he really think about the black community? Can we get
all right. So I mean, to answer the question, I think that there's been this experiment that's been run in the black community in our country since the 1960s, with effectively all this welfare money coming in, and in a way, it's kind of like a giant Ponzi scheme. So I think that if you're a high IQ person, right, and you do well for yourself, I think we as kind of Catholics or whatever, we have a duty to kind of take care of the least among ourselves. Like, I agree with the social justice teachings of the Pope on this question. I agree that capitalism can be excessive, right? And so we have this duty. Now, what happens is that a lot of people don't want to deal with, you know, kind of adopting lower IQ segments of the population. And so what they do, and I understand how terrible this sounds, by the way. I'm totally aware of like how verboten and non-PC it is. What they do is they create these elaborate structures of charity, or they create these various kind of things like the welfare state to basically make themselves feel good about the activism that they're doing. And what they do is they force everyone else to participate in it. And so I don't think it's real charity. I don't think it actually makes the world a better place. Now, it is a statistical fact in the United States that blacks disproportionately commit lots of crime. Even when you rule out the drug stuff, even when you rule out all this stuff, even when you just look at the violence stats, even you look at the rape stats. Now, I wish this weren't so, right? I think there are other subpopulations in the United States that also have this issue. For instance, the Alaskan Inuits, the Inuits or whatever, the Alaskan natives, have a very high rate of rape and alcohol-related issues, and that might be a genetic situation there too. I don't know. I've looked into it somewhat. It's hard to tell. But we are very different in the United States, right? We have some Samoan immigrants that live, that are Samoan Americans who are 58 years old. That's their average life expectancy. And you have Japanese women who live in New Jersey who live well into their 90s. So this idea of like one-size-fits-all policy is very complicated and very difficult to really talk about. So when it comes to blacks, blacks do disproportionately commit crime. I have been mugged twice, actually in the same like 24-hour to 48-hour period in Baltimore, of all places, where my cousins own a shop. I do think there's an extent to which, like after the British riots of I think 2011, where people were using Twitter to basically target and destroy various properties, I think Twitter became a very dangerous device for social justice warriors and for the Soros type of basically instigating riots. And I think we've seen this in Ferguson. I think we've seen this in Baltimore. I think we're going to continue to see it. And I think it's extremely terrifying, the extent to which flash mobs can become flash riots very quickly.
Well, let's move off the race question, because I think most people will have a clearer idea of what you believe now. And I think it reflects what they will have read in a lot of places, actually, that most of which are characterized as right-wing, but some of them are not. I think that people are used to hearing those lines of argument, so I think we know where you are on that.
Right. So, for instance, like on the just as a side note, yeah. I had a conversation. One of the things that got a lot of trouble is I don't believe in speech codes. I think speech codes are a reflection of power and a reflection of one group. So, like for instance, the N-word. I don't like saying racial slurs, not because I don't. How would I put this? I think a slur is only useful if it's personal. Like it's the who issue. So right, like if you call somebody a fag or whatever, it's not really useful or helpful, right? Except in an ironic sense. So when I understood that when I tweet out like the N-word, and I don't like the word not because of the racial connotations, just because I think it's kind of a lazy kind of thing. I think
why would you use that word at all if people get so upset about it, and if it's not useful and you don't need to do it?
Oh, well, I did that to prove a point about how Twitter's algorithm works and how all these people would follow me and retweet it and status signal about it.
Right, but you sort of proved the point by getting banned, didn't you?
No, not in this case. I actually was banned for, in this particular case, I was banned for the take out phrase. I've never been banned for saying,
Let's talk a little bit about Twitter.
Go ahead.
So it seems to me Twitter is increasingly treating its users like children. We have this filtering thing now, which I've experienced, which is denying me the opportunity to see what a lot of my followers are saying to me, are talking to me about. For example, a Jewish guy was saying, oh, well, it's all right for everyone unless you are a dreaded Jew. And he was speaking about himself and his fellow Jews, but for whatever reason, either his account or that tweet had been flagged as something that I should never see. So he was the Twitter equivalent of shadow banned, right? He didn't know that I'd never see his reply. And it was only drawn to my attention because a third party saw it and said, did you see this? And I hadn't. And when I looked at the replies to his tweet, it didn't appear to me. So there's all sorts of stuff going on under the surface that we don't necessarily know about with them. And they seem to be treating users like children. And I wondered if you have a view, before we get onto your specific case.
Yes, I 100% agree. And I would say just generally, I think we are approaching kind of, and I don't use these words like, this is not me saying this as like trying to scare you in a Fox News right-wing kind of scary way, right? When I use the word tyranny, I mean an actual tyrant, right? And I think there is a sense in which Twitter is becoming, by virtue of the way the technology itself is constructed, right? It's what's known as an open protocol. It's becoming a very tyrannical place. And what I mean by this, and why I'm fighting this, and why I'm using Twitter, not just to influence public discourse in the form of all the journalists who follow me. I mean, I had millions of people who read my tweets all the time. And it's a form of kind of advertising in a way, if you want. And I was using it, as Jesse James famously says, right? Twitter, basically I rob banks because that's where the money is, right? Why am I on Twitter? Because that's where the people that I want to influence are, right? And I have very little, financial means. I can't go and like advertise everywhere, Madison Avenue, whatever. I can't put up pages in the Wall Street Journal, whatever. I can't advertise on Gawker. And so I'm restricted in my kind of power and ability to influence the world. And I think Twitter was a vehicle, and perhaps can be again a vehicle, but for basically influencing the world and actually changing the discourse. That was what it was intended to be. It's what people talk about in Hatching Twitter, the book that was written by Nick Bilton, or Bitton, or however you say his name. It's an extremely important technology. It's probably one of the most important technologies of our lifetime. And I don't, you know, what's going on with it right now, where what's happening is it's using the kind of mass social justice warrior thing to offend the algorithm and mass report you. It's using that, and it has a sort of a de facto left-wing bias, because we who are sort of on the right, or those of us who are sympathetic to the right, we don't go and tattle on one another. It's not our way, right? We handle our problems our own way. We don't create block lists, for instance, to go and shut people down. And what's happened is Twitter has essentially, like, I think 800 people. I think I've heard estimates of 1,200 people. It has very few people, and it has millions of users. So of all these users, what ends up happening is you end up getting censorship by mob rule. And that, to me, is against what Twitter stands for. I mean, they banned, for instance, I've had all these people come over to my home to set up Twitter accounts, to teach senior citizens how to use Twitter, because I believed in the technology, right? Anyone who set up or ever tweeted from my IP address at my home office has now been banned, including people who I've taught to be whistleblowers in California government using, I mean, all of these accounts have been frozen and paralyzed. Yeah. Now, I think this is extremely destructive for liberal values generally. And I understand why, because Twitter in the final analysis is a business designed to sell you ads. But the problem that they have as a business model is that people don't buy stuff they see on Twitter. Well, I mean, when was the last time you really went and bought something that you saw advertised on Twitter, or on Facebook for that matter? When you buy something, it's on Amazon, or you search it on Google, right? So the problem they have is that they're massively overvalued, and they have this sort of black box about how the policies actually work. Because if people knew what that black box was, we could manipulate it in ways that that might be to our own betterment, or to our own self-interest. And so Twitter has a huge interest in basically keeping out inquiries into its architecture and into its the people who make the decisions. And given all the conversation about Twitter being a utility, I mean, think about this: the 800 people who work at Twitter, presumably they're engineers, presumably they're all kinds of people. They have a certain level of kind of corporate power that is unsurpassed by anyone, that exceeds anything the robber barons could have ever imagined, that exceeds anything Pulitzer could have ever fantasized about. So I think there's a certain degree to which we have to kind of push back against that. And
let me cut you off there, because this touches on something that was in your lawyer's letter to Twitter as well.
Yes.
Now, there's a criticism on what is often a ludicrous website, Pando Daily, pando.com. It said your critique of Twitter was quite left-wing, because you were effectively saying that a private corporation should not have unbridled decision-making power when it comes to who uses its service and who doesn't. Separate from your considerations about loss of income and whatever, if I understand your argument correctly, it's that Twitter is now such a pervasive and democratically important medium that it has now become worthwhile to consider whether free speech should be mandated on the platform, or at least whether Twitter should be. The idea that if censorship on Twitter has some meaning, if that is censorship as we understand the term, if people can be, if someone is silenced on Twitter, and that is significantly important to them, that has become de facto censorship, should we force Twitter to allow some people to have a voice that the company doesn't want to? Now, that's a left-wing argument, right? That is. Yeah,
hold on. Let me tease it out more, because I don't think it's a left-wing argument.
Okay.
I actually think it has. It has parallels in the form of people who are the trust busters. I mean, maybe a progressive argument, if you will, rather than a left-wing one necessarily. I do think there is a danger in which monopolistic corporate power ends up cozying up to government. So we see this with Twitter working with the White House on issues that they want to trend. We see this with the kind of revolving door between government, people in the media, and then in Twitter. You kind of see this kind of revolving loop between Silicon Valley
And then at the
power.
local level, you have the tax breaks
Right. I mean,
in San Francisco.
if you want to build a competitor to Twitter right now, it's extremely difficult, and that's not just because of the technology aspects of it. It's because of a lot of regulations that occur. I mean, for instance, the government has asked Twitter to do various favors for it, and Twitter has obliged them, such as the Iranian Revolution and other things. So now Twitter has signed on the question of they've signed on the question of net neutrality, and they've said that we don't think that internet service providers should be able to regulate and shut down content, right? And yet they're shutting down content, including mine, including people like Josh Smith. They've shut down these accounts, and they don't give it any real due process, any real appeals process, and they've shut us down largely because we have controversial things to say and we're white males. Like, that's a part of it, and I wish it were not that case. Now, do I want to live in a kind of libertarian utopia in which it would be great if we could all start businesses? And to a certain extent, I mean, there is a certain element to which I like the idea of, sort of libertarianism as a political construct, but I also kind of find myself drawn to communism as Marx outlined it. Things are complicated, for instance, and so in this case with the Pando Daily argument, yeah, you have a corporate power thing. Twitter members, Twitter staffers have referred to themselves as a utility. What do we do to utilities? We regulate them, right? And why do we regulate them? Because we think that there's a danger in having a one provider policy or one provider solution, and it can be quite dangerous. The right tends to be dismissive of kind of the left-wing kind of corporate arguments about corporations being evil, and I'm dismissive of the right-wing arguments about. I mean, I agree with the right on the Citizens United thing. I agree with them on a lot of basically campaign finance laws being bullshit. But I'm not entirely persuaded that natural monopolies are always and everywhere a good thing for human beings and for human liberty. And I'm also not persuaded that union power can be abusive, but can also be doing good things too, as we saw. There are reasons that countries set up unions. So I kind of eschew the kind of left-right divide that's kind of going on here, and I think it's kind of disturbing in a way that this is how it's happening.
Mm-hmm. So Dick Costolo basically said that people try to pass off. It's just something like people try to pass off political discussion as harassment and the other way around. And he's also said that he wants to get these people off the platform. These people, he means abusive and harassing people. But I think under the surface there, he also means conservatives we don't like that we can't really answer, who upset our friends. Now, that seems to be the message that a lot of people are getting from Twitter. It seems to be the root of the problem that you've experienced. It's that not so much that Twitter really cares about getting rid of harassment and abuse, because there doesn't seem to be much of that. I mean, I'm pretty hardline on this too, I think, like you. I find it astonishing and preposterous that anybody could really claim to have been abused by words on a computer screen. But it does seem to be the case that Twitter is staking out a political position here, which is that there are...
the same way GoFundMe is staking out positions as well.
Right.
Right. I mean, GoFundMe has decided that however you feel about these cops, accused of this issue, we do believe in the United States of America, at least at the present moment, that all have a right to trial and all have a right to confront their accusers, right? Which is a big reason that animated my rape stuff of naming people who claim to be rape victims, right? Yeah. Because I think you have a right to confront your accuser. If you don't have that basic right, you don't really have a right. And in the court of public opinion, there's sort of this attitude about certain things are not permissible. So my old mentor and boss, Alan Dershowitz, once said that Nightline is the court of last resort, not the Supreme Court. I think Twitter is increasingly the court of last resort. And so their decision to ban me was an exercise of power. And I filed multiple appeals to their suspension process, which is extremely opaque. I filed multiple. I'm a Twitter shareholder. Like I believe in the company as it was constituted. But this kind of use policy that they're creating is going to affect the valuation of Twitter as a company. It's going to affect the culture of the net generally, and it's going to affect all kinds of discussions. And if you look at kind of the way our liberties are being eroded on the net, so where they have child molesters, black nationalists, all these kind of fringe left groups who are allowed to raise money. But if you go and you look at cops who are accused of a crime, we don't allow them to actually fundraise for their own defense. I mean, it seems kind of preposterous. Or if you're a Christian baker, you know, who's being, and by the way, I have mixed kind of views about the whole Christian baker, you know, homosexual thing. Like, if you are in the public square, you know, this whole argument that was going on with the gays and the Christian bakers in the United States, right, is if you're in the public square, don't you have a right to, you know, give certain reasonable accommodations of people, say if they're a homosexual or, you know, disposition or whatever, if they're homosexuals. And I kind of agree with that argument to a certain extent. But it's interesting to see all the people who viscerally went after these kind of small businesses in the middle of a hick part of the country, who viscerally went after them, shut down their Yelp pages and everything, are totally okay with Twitter just censoring people that it doesn't like. And that's a really kind of disturbing hypocrisy that is total bullshit, and it should be called out and fought.
Yeah. I mean, Twitter seems to hinge pretty much on the word of quite extreme progressive voices. We're not just talking about the New York Times here. We're talking about, you know, the Jezebels, the BuzzFeeds. I mean, these people are on the fringe of mainstream debate. But every time they complain about something, Twitter seems to come up with a new harebrained scheme that ends in disaster. I mean, they're now talking about banning porn. Do you have views on how this is all going to end up for them? Because, you know, if they start listening to these sort of sex-negative feminists who cry abuse at everything, they're going to end up with, you know, pretty much all of the interesting monetizable content is going to disappear, isn't it?
Well, I mean, here's the interesting question, right? So I don't really know what pornography actually is. Like, I kind of agree with Camille Paglia's argument. So I kind of agree with Camille Paglia's argument that porn is basically forcing somebody to see something that they wouldn't actually enjoy seeing, but a lot of people enjoy seeing porn. So it's kind of like, it's kind of complicated. I'm not a big porn fan. It doesn't really, I mean, I was married at 24. I very much love my wife. It's sort of not my thing. But I want to live in a society where pornographers have rights, like, and they actually exist as human beings. And I think to a certain extent, my kind of view on porn generally is that I'd like to have it for non-commercial uses so that no one was actually forced into porn. But I think the internet is kind of doing that already by basically driving down the costs. So it's kind of an interesting kind of debate, kind of an interesting discussion. I'll just interrupt you there. I want to talk a little bit more about sort of double standards with the way that Twitter applies policies and the decisions it makes. Now, if you do a search, for example, on George Zimmerman, you can find somebody practically every hour saying that they want to shoot him, they want to kill him, they want to, they want to cause him physical harm. If you search on particular hashtags that are dedicated to murdering, all white men, and various things like that, you can pretty much find horrible incitements to real violence and things that do have real world consequences. Valerie Solanas taking a shot at Andy Warhol, for example, versus the sort of stuff that we've seen with you, which is a metaphor, which is obviously a metaphor and not going to not going anywhere. It seems to me like there's an extraordinary double standard, but also that the hypocrisy is so particularly acute because there's real serious hatred on one side of this political divide, which is left entirely unmolested because of these wacky ideas about whatever kind of bigotry is power plus privilege and all this kind of crap. If you are born with the wrong skin color and develop the wrong politics, you're sort of relentlessly pursued for metaphor. Whereas if you aren't, you can say you're going to kill people, you can say you want to murder and maim and harm and exclude whoever you want. And Twitter's perfectly fine with all of that, isn't it? Yeah, I would note, so there's this, when I worked for Dershowitz, we had this discussion we talked a lot about what an actual threat constitutes. And under the law, there's a standard of time, manner, and place. So I can't say I'm going to kill this motherfucker. I could say I'm going to kill this motherfucker, right? But if I say I'm going to kill you, motherfucker, at this particular location, this particular place, that's a threat. And so a lot of things where people say I'm going to kill you, I'm going to harm you, I'm going to whatever, it's very difficult to tell like whether or not these are actual real legitimate threats, and whether or not Twitter. I mean, we developed a whole jurisprudence around what a threat is in the Anglo-American tradition. And And so it's a lot more kind of complicated than I think they want to give credit for.
It's been redefined, hasn't it, as words that upset me. I mean,
right. And
harassment has been redefined in the last 10 years as somebody who presents an argument that I can't respond to in language that I can misrepresent as offensive or too aggressive.
Right. And I think so. The writer, the Thaddeus Russell, who's at Occidental and whose work I enjoy a lot, he has this discussion about how it's strategically a good idea to have free speech. Not necessarily because it's just a strategic thing, just so you know what ideas are out there, right? And I think that we should have a culture of free speech. So we should permit speech that is complicated, that is politically, and this includes, by the way, Islamist speech. I agree that there's sometimes where the standards are dangerous, where there is actual sedition and they're trying to overthrow the government. I think that's all kind of thing, but I think there's a useful mechanism of actually discussing this speech in a serious kind of way. And part of the reason I had kind of this example that I use that I think about often, actually. I don't actually use it all that often. But when I was a kid, I used to go to a pizza place. There was only one pizza place kind of in the town I lived in that was any good. And it was run by a racist, like a virulent, like terrible racist, like the suit Nazi from Seinfeld, but like to another level. And he would refer to people by the N-word when they walked into his store. Like, he just didn't give a damn. His pizza was delicious. It was also the cheapest around, and my friends and I, many of them, it was in the 2000s. My friends of different races, different Jews, whatever. We would go and eat at his pizza place, right? Because we valued his pizza more than we valued his views, right? And I think that's true of how people actually approach the real world, right? We all have relatives that say things that are nonsense and insane, but we love them because they're our relatives or because we engage them. So, Tom Sowell famously talks about a case where he was a photographer for the Marines, where he was black and he had these white racists come to him to basically help them with their photography, right? And I think that's where real discourse and real like change of minds happen, right? That's where people who have experiences of like actual homosexuals in the real world, not accepting that bullshit study that came out that was fraud, but people who have actual experiences of that, they actually know like what it means. If you live in a gay neighborhood, for instance, as I did in West Hollywood, you start to have certain views that are formed by just dealing with people as human beings, as individuals. And I think the social justice left doesn't want that. That's why they're trying to marginalize people. Like the Gamergate thing is a perfect example of this. And what they did inadvertently is they picked on an industry that's so massive and large, and that has people who work and tirelessly kind of have effort towards getting a very small reward, which is status points on a video game, right? Mm-hmm. And what they ultimately did is they turned the process of the internet itself and of breaking news and doing research into a game. And as somebody who benefits from this, it got news and everything, this was a huge, kind of revolutionary thing, which the social justice warriors thought that they could just use their power that they had. The Anita Sarkeesians of the world, they thought that they could use their kind of victim status to raise money, and indeed they did. But what they did, not kind of thinking about it, was they created a culture of people who are now basically an army of everyday people who are like me, who are autistic, who are different, who have been bullied, who enjoy video games, enjoy having fun. And by the way, I used to play StarCraft, I used to play Age of Empires 2, I used to play as the Turks.
Gamergate credibility assured with that.
Yeah, I mean, my video game credentials, Elon Musk likes to say he majored in first-person shooters at college. Like, I PhD'd in it. So
I
I'm
have
very
no
much
gamer credentials at all,
Yeah.
and they've been very welcoming to me. So I'm sure you'll be fine.
No, because they're real human beings. Because they like to talk about their games. They like to talk about their hobbies.
What's been interesting, actually,
Yeah.
what's been interesting throughout this is watching people who had no prior knowledge of what gamer culture was like engaging in Gamergate. I mean, there's a guy from the Society of Professional Journalists at the moment trying to put a conference together. I think it's going to happen. And he said, I'm trying my hardest to get both sides to dislike me, but it's really difficult because these gamers are just such nice guys. And I suppose part of the function of this sort of shutdown, silencing, and censorship, these practices, is to avoid those conversations ever happening. Because when you do have those conversations, you discover actually people are really smart. They just don't always think the same. And this This is replicated everywhere, really. If you go right down to college, you got Thomas Sowell wrote this for National Review the other day. If people graduating from places like Oberlin, you will never have heard of 95% of the viewpoints that are out there. Go and engage with them. Go and experience some. And it seems very much as though Twitter being this sort of playground of activists and feminists for such a long time, and is now there's a much better representation of ordinary people on the platform. They don't like it, and they're trying to reverse time.
Indeed, and I think
a period when they ran the platform as a fiefdom.
I think so, and I do have to go in like 5 minutes because we want to be on Australian radio, so I'm going to do that. So no disrespect meant. But and I'm happy to do these things on a semi-regular basis because I like the way your mind thinks about these problems. But I do think there's a problem that exists when people start freely associating for sort of totalitarians generally. So this is why I'm friends with pro-Israel people. This is why I'm friends with people who are anti-Jews. This is why I'm friends with all different types of individuals. Why? Because this mind belongs to me. Right? I make my own determinations about the universe. And a lot of the times I don't know what the hell I think about something, particularly when there's something as vast as the internet. And so when I like people who are actually like making an argument, who are challenging authority, who are actually saying certain things. And they may well be wrong. I think there are a lot of opinions that are just batshit crazy on the internet, right? I think maybe some people would argue I have some of them, right? But I want people to actually think about these things.
This is one of the reasons, and I don't think he would mind me saying this is one of the reasons I find Andrew Auenheimer so fascinating. That is most.
Yeah, we are friends. Yeah.
Right. And he and I talk privately, and I find his views on Jews utterly abhorrent. But he's also a massively fascinating and highly intelligent character. That why would I cut myself off from that? I'm capable of understanding him as a complete human being, and not even dissociating, but sort of declining to engage with some of these things and benefiting from
right. And the attitude that people have is that you are mainstreaming certain things by engaging it, right?
Right.
And I think there's a truth to that, maybe in the older way of looking at the world, right? Where if you go to communist memberships, but the way I look at it is there's this essay, What You Can't Say by Paul Graham, which I highly recommend. That and the essay Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Live Not by Lies, which is basically how to destroy totalitarianism, which is basically to stop telling lies and stop allowing them to be told in your presence, which is what I was trying to do on Twitter. But the Paul Graham thing about what you can't say, the ism discussion, whenever somebody says something, the best argument against something is that's false, right? That's bullshit. That is against our objective standards of reality, right? If somebody's saying that's heterophobic or whatever, or it's ist, it's some ist that they use.
Any
that's
kind of
communist.
problematic objection.
That's what?
Any kind of problematic objection.
Right. They're really just articulating the taboos and the moral fashions of their time.
Right.
Now these things might be just. Like I actually agree with justice, right? I agree with being social. I don't believe we should round up the gays or any of this other sort of nonsense. And by the way, a lot of the white supremacists that I've talked to, like in the real kind of world, there's no like massive program to exterminate anyone. They want to just be left alone, and they want to be allowed to live in their own like little white supremacist communities. And I find that kind of like tragically fascinating. Of like this infinite amount of information in the universe right now, information always doubling, always exceeding, always growing, and yet what we've all decided is that we're all going to join tribes and live in our own kind of intellectual mental ghettos. Like why? Like fuck that, And I think that approach is kind of really old-fashioned and a really dangerous way of thinking about the universe. And I oppose it, and I would fight it to the very end if necessary.
I think that's given.
If I get suspended, if that means I go to real jail, if that means he went to real jail. I mean, he and I were tweeting back and forth, not tweeting back and forth, messaging back and emailing back and forth. And he went to like real jail for a bullshit crime. That was bullshit, however you looked at it. He basically showed AT&T their own house wasn't locked, and they punished him by trying to jail him. Just like they tried to punish Aaron Schwartz by basically being a nerd and downloading all these books. Just like they tried to punish James O'Keefe for recording videos of a senator in their office, right? This kind of tyranny that's occurring towards hackers, towards revenge porn enthusiasts, towards all of this kind of culture that's forming. And it's slowly, against John Derbyshire, against the Pax Dickinsons of the world, Another great book, by the way, is "So You've Been Publicly Shamed" by John Ronson, which I just finished. It's
very
fantastic.
good. I can encourage everyone to read that too.
So this kind of culture is extremely destructive. We've got to fight it because liberalism. This is what's at stake, and I do have to go in a moment. So,
sure. Well, listen, I think we can wrap up there. Actually, I think that most people watching this will have been very pleasantly surprised by you, if that's not too patronizing, compared to your Twitter persona, certainly, and interested to hear about some of the reasons why you think as you do. I'd like to do this again sometime, but in the meantime, I think that's given a really robust and effective defense from you of what Twitter is getting wrong and what some of the social reasons for that may be. So thanks for spending the time. And
I'm happy to talk about any of these issues anytime. And people can reach me at editor@gotnews.com because I am banned on Twitter. And they can. I'm at Charles C. Johnson on Facebook, and there are all these other platforms. And I intend to keep fighting as long as there's fight in the courts, fight in the streets. As your famous guy said, the landing grounds and all that nonsense.
Well, yes, let's hope it doesn't end up in a jail term.
Well, we have a Second Amendment here, my friend. You should expatriate. But
let's hope it doesn't end in prison time for you, unless you do something really terrible. Thank you for spending time. All right, thanks a lot.
Well, bye.
Take care. Bye bye.